Okay. Bye-bye. Wow, everybody was waiting.
Got them trained.
Yeah.
Maureen?
Okay, I'm going to mute people.
Oh, like you muted yourself, Terry.
What is that?
Let me shut this off.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Don't turn it off. Trying to get in. No, pause it.
Oh, okay.
Hello?
Hi, I'm Peter Bishop.
Hi, Jim Toza. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can hear you too.
I got no video, that's why.
Maureen, for some reason or other, we can't hear you, but you're not muted.
Oh, can you
You
hear me
want-
now?
Do you want me to speak again? I just wasn't talking.
Wait a minute. There's something going on here.
Yeah.
Yes, please introduce Chuck.
Oh, okay. I got a picture now. I got you now.
I can hear you clearly.
But I can't see you.
Hi, Maureen, we're unable to hear you right now.
Okay.
We may have
Wait.
two Maureens on this call.
Okay. I'll try again the next time.
Oh, no, hello. Please don't hang up. Okay. Our board member, Maureen, will be introducing UUJEC and Chuck Collins to our group. Maureen, do you have a speaker, microphone?
Lord.
Cannot hear you. Is your phone muted, Maureen?
Might be.
Yes. Can you hear me now? Okay. I am going to try to put it on speaker. Before, when it was on speaker, there was a echo. And actually, I'm getting an echo now.
Terry, can you mute the video of Maureen?
Can I what?
Mute the video of Maureen.
Oh, yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Okay,
I just muted it.
there we
Okay.
go.
Okay. Now I'm going to try the speaker on my phone.
The electronic.
It's working.
Yeah.
Not now.
Can you hear me? Oh, man. I'm getting a crazy echo.
Oh, guess what?
Are you getting that?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Okay. Wow. Okay, this is Maureen Malashevsky. I'm a board member of the UUJEC and co-founder of Thrive Living Wage Coalition in Southwest Colorado. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar presented by the Unitarian Universalists for a Just Economic Community with our guest speaker, Chuck Collins. UUs for a Just Economic Community has been working for over 2 decades to provide UUs with the tools they need to advocate on economic justice issues important to their congregations. We build relationships with others working toward justice, and we celebrate congregations and social justice committees making great strides towards equity in their communities through our newsletter, our Economic Justice Spotlight Award, and our website, uujec.com. Now a bit about Chuck Collins. Chuck Collins is a UU based at the Institute for Policy Studies. He writes extensively on inequality and is the author of Born on Third Base. A one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. His previous books include 99 to 1 and Wealth in Our Commonwealth, co-authored with Bill Gates Sr. His articles appear in The Nation, The American Prospect, and numerous other magazines and news outlets, including inequality.org. Chuck co-founded Wealth for the Common Good, now merged with Patriotic Millionaires, United for a Fair Economy, Divest, Invest, and other organizations. His work on inequality has been covered by The Guardian, Forbes, International Business Times, Wired, Los Angeles Times, Politico, CNBC, Black Enterprise Magazine, and other national and international media outlets. As an active member of the UUJEC Advisory Board, we appreciate Chuck's enduring commitment to justice and equality and welcome his participation in our webinar series. Today, Chuck will describe initiatives cities and communities are carrying out to reverse inequality, from Massachusetts to California. Welcome, Chuck, and thank you for the amazing work you do and for joining us today.
Thanks, Maureen. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Greetings from cold Boston here. And thanks to Rachel, as always, for getting us all together, and Terry and Maureen and others who are kind of on the UUJEC steering committee. And I thought I'd just share a couple of thoughts and then look forward to kind of a real discussion with you all, just kind of what's on your mind. I don't know about you, but I was kind of a little, after the tax bill passed in December, it was like the darkness kind of came in on me, not in a really depression way, but just like it was, I had personally, and lots of us had fought hard against that tax cut. And it was just, it was hard to see it kind of roll through the way it did. But I think it is kind of important to remember that we kind of won public opinion, even if we lost the vote. Tax cuts generally poll really popular. Who doesn't want a tax cut? And yet, somewhere between 25-30% of the population just thought this was a terrible idea, that it was totally biased toward the wealthy, towards corporations. They didn't buy it. After 35 years of trickle down economic promises, people generally weren't buying it. And so it's important to remember that, because that was a result of the work, the education work, the kind of letters to the editor and op-eds and conversations that all of us had with people. I think it did have an effect. And I think that, we know that the tax bill will become more popular over time because, A, amnesia, political amnesia. Secondly, because you have to sort of admire the way they rolled this out, with these corporations announcing these wage increases and bonuses and the kind of stuff that progressive groups could not pull off. Getting these mass announcements. So you have to sort of, and the fact that the Koch brothers network is going to spend $400 million to sort of make the tax cut into this great one accomplishment that's going to be the basis on which their elections will be won or lost. So, I think one of the things that I found encouraging, though, is just to kind of look at, people have not given up. There's still there's still a contested debate about this, whether that tax cut is a good idea, whether there's going to be any real good economic benefits. The fact that the stock market is in volatility and over frothing moment, and all these things. So I think but I want to just talk a little bit about things that I'm noticing happening in cities and states. And I see there are, 25 people on the call. I don't know where you're all based, but I'll mention just a few things that I'm noticing, and then maybe you're seeing some things too in your state or that you want to report on. But I think this is a good moment to kind of take a look at what are, I would call them potentially game-changing policy initiatives or campaigns that we can undertake in our communities, in states, that do a couple things. One is that they actually engage people in terms of something meaningful, deliver something like, debt-free or free tuition, or affordable housing, or a living wage, things that actually will make a difference, but also things that reduce the concentration of wealth and power, public policies that not only raise the floor, but sort of begin to address the corrosive effects of concentrated wealth and power. And so I think that there are a couple things that I would just mention. And the first thing I'll just talk about is what's happening to housing. And again, this depends on where you live, but in a lot of coastal communities and states and in major metropolitan areas, there's just, housing costs have just kind of delinked from people's incomes. The intensity of the affordable housing crisis is accelerating. It's in part because of this wealth inequality effect. Wealthy people are bidding up the cost of land and housing, pushing it out of reach. And there's this global phenomena in some of our communities where there's just international capitalists coming in. And, in major metropolitan areas, we're seeing, huge new residential luxury housing being built. And think of these as kind of like wealth storage units, just like the storage unit complex you see on, at the mini mall. This is a form of where people from around the world are parking their excess capital. The United States is, it is a tax haven. It is a place where if you're from China or Russia and you're trying to get wealth out of your home country, you bring it here and you put it in real estate. And it's just from a wealthy perspective, it's like another asset class. You have your money in the stock market, but you also have your real estate holdings. And you don't even really care if it's earning money. It's just a way to hold wealth and value. And that's having a huge distorting impact in certain communities. Some of these buildings are ghost towns. I live in Boston. I could give you the tour now of 4 giant residential office towers or residences, where, units of, a couple $1 million and up, and they're vacant. People aren't living in them. There are some people living in them. There's one building that has like 200 units, and only half of them, they're all bought, they're all owned, but they're owned by trusts and shell corporations and all this. And I was talking to one of the doormen there. I said, how many people actually live here? And he was joking. He says, we're all staffed up, but it's like staffing. It's like being a valet in a ghost town. You're just happy to see somebody when they come in, So that's just the level of weird distortions that these inequalities of wealth are causing. And of course, it's pushing up the cost of land and housing. It's pushing people out of neighborhoods. It's raising the cost of rental housing. You add in the sort of Airbnb factor, removing rental housing from the market, and it's just creating these acute crises. And one little interesting thing is that, so San Francisco, where of course it's like worse than San Francisco, if you've been there any time in the last few years, it's just like, it is a dystopian future of inequality, because you have so much wealth. And then, I used to walk through the Tenderloin, and the Tenderloin was always a neighborhood that had a lot of, rooming houses and displacement, but it's now like an open homeless shelter. People are just living on the streets and living in tents, and So it's kind of the most acute example of what inequality run amok looks like. But the voters of San Francisco 15 months ago passed an initiative to levy a high-end real estate transfer tax, so a tax on commercial and residential properties that sell for over $5 million. And that in the last year, that raised about $44 million. And they didn't earmark it, but the city council wisely said, if the voters pass this, here's what we'll do with it. And one of the uses is they have made tuition at the Community College of San Francisco free. Not only that, they provide books for students, transit, they provide a stipend. Enrollment has gone up 16%. I've been doing interviews with some of the students. I have to say it's incredibly moving. I mean, they're the stories, the testimonials of what it means for some of them to be able to attend college without putting financial stresses on their families. So it's a great example to what I would call a game-changing initiative. It's capturing or dealing with the distorting impact of inequality at the highest top end of the economy, and it's directing revenue to something that actually expands opportunity for other people. And I have been kind of on the road talking to different cities, Cincinnati and New York, here in Boston where I live. Other cities are saying, what would it look like to put in place one of these very high-end real estate transfer taxes and dedicate the revenue to a permanently affordable housing trust fund for community land trusts for affordable housing and other things that actually would address the problem. And there's a huge interest in that because people see the upending upheaval caused by wealth inequality at the top. So I think we're going to see in the next couple of months, more kind of campaigns emerging to, sort of link to create more resources for affordable housing that draw revenue from the distorting impact or, both speculation and high-end real estate transfers. Now, I realize if you're sitting in Youngstown, Ohio, this is may not be a relevant proposal, but we have some other ideas for communities like that. But I think in the sort of acute inequality where there really is actually a wealth effect problem, that's the kind of thing to look at. Vancouver is another city that I think they have a vacant property law now. You actually have a very steep tax if you leave your property vacant, if you take it off the market. Lots of jurisdictions now are reforming Airbnb laws to say, look, if you're, mom and pop apartment renting out a room, or you have, you're in a 3-family house and you're renting out an apartment for under a certain number of days a year, that's fine. But if you're like a developer and you're building buildings and there's essentially Airbnb hotels, or you're taking properties that were in the rental market off the market, to regulate that so that the cost of affordable rental housing isn't just sort of pushed up. So that's just an idea that I'm happy to talk more about that. Another thing the city of Portland did is they passed an ordinance to tax corporations. They have a business excise tax in that city that applies to any corporations that do business in the city of Portland. They passed an excise tax on corporations with pay ratios over 100 to 1. So it pretty much applies almost entirely to some of the bigger corporations, but there's like 500 companies that operate in Portland that have, like Nike and others that have these, enormous pay ratio gaps. So they're essentially creating an incentive to like raise the floor and reduce that gap between highest paid and lowest paid worker. And starting this spring, under what's under the Financial Reform Act, Dodd-Frank, corporations are required to disclose their pay ratio between top and average worker, top and bottom worker. This is a new thing. So in proxy statements, public corporations are going to have to disclose this. As much as they've fought it over the last few years, it's an actual real, it's going to happen. They may turn around and try to repeal it the moment it takes effect. but that's going to mean that we're going to have this information about companies. We're going to know what the pay ratio gap is within a company, and we can use those as a way to educate and embarrass and actually legislate state and municipal policies that say, look, if a company is paying has that kind of compensation gap, we shouldn't subsidize it with low tax rates. We shouldn't subsidize it and treat that as a business expense. We should create incentives for those companies to raise their pay floor and close their pay gap. A couple other just things that I think are kind of encouraging, and again, in this moment where, the national government is essentially, how do we say it? It's captured, captured by corporations and the wealthy. Where do we have room to move? Where do we have agency? I think there's some cool stuff happening in states. I just wrote an article in The Nation that came out on Monday about the California College for All initiative. So California law in 2001, and as part of the tax reform under George W. Bush, many states lost their state level estate taxes. 32 states. Some of the states where you live may not have a state inheritance tax or a state tax because it sort of phased out. In simple words, the state tax used to piggyback on the federal tax, and then they reformed the federal law and they eliminated that pickup. So in California, that the state pickup, the state share of the federal estate tax was, substantial. It was about $1 billion a year of revenue that was lost starting in 2001, 2005. It went away entirely. I estimate they've lost over $16 billion in revenue. And you could draw a direct line between that and what's happened to public higher education. The cost, the investment, the state's investment in public higher education has probably gone down $20 billion. And that just meant it's been shifted onto parents and students and onto tuition. So you can make that case that the public investment went down, and that's contributed to this ridiculous student debt situation. 44 million households have student debt. 1.4 trillion dollars of debt now, more than auto debt, credit card debt. That's a constituency. That's a constituency of young people who could get mobilized. And so, lo and behold, after some of you know Michael Teasdale, who sometimes on these calls, Michael and I talked about this a couple of years ago. He was really seeding this idea. Let's restore the state estate tax and dedicate the revenue to public higher education. And so now there's a great coalition of students. It's pretty much led by students going to the ballot. They're trying to collect signatures, raise money. California College for All. If they restore the state estate tax, it would dedicate to a fund for public access to higher education. They estimate restoring the state estate tax with their rate plan would raise $4 billion a year, which would pretty much make all community college and state university education tuition free. 80% of it would be means tested, so it would really help the students who need it the most. But it would overall lower the cost of higher education. So, I can't think of anything more beautiful than that. Partly because it engages this whole segment of younger voters. That's really part of the intention. It would enormously boost turnout in 2018 if they can get on the ballot. So they got great ballot language from the Attorney General and all that. So they have to collect 585,000 signatures. They need every nickel that they can get. So just to alert you that that's happening, and in part, I think it's a model for other states. So I think Michigan, Florida, there's a lot of states that have lost their state estate taxes, and we could be fixing that. Sounds like somebody in my on the other side of my apartment wall is doing a carpentry project. I'm sorry about that. The other, I'll just mention a couple other states, what states are doing. Maine is going to the ballot again this fall. They have an initiative, this is interesting, to raise the state payroll tax on incomes over $127,000. So you know that at the federal level, there's a cap on the Social Security withholding payroll tax. Once you sort of hit a fairly high amount, 127,000, you no longer have Social Security withholding from that. So they proposed in the state of Maine, you know, to like a 1.9, almost 2% additional payroll taxes on incomes over that amount, and dedicating the money to what they call in-house home aid, you know, keeping people in their homes as they age, support for in-home assistance. And it's part of that caring economy. It's the domestic workers and other groups who are part of sort of caretaking. And in a rural state like Maine, I think it's a really great model. So that's a progressive initiative that is going to help a lot of people, and it's going to be paid for by those who can pay the most. Have the in my own home state of Massachusetts, we have a ballot initiative to raise our income tax on incomes over 1 million. So if your income is over 1 million, you will pay an additional 4% on any income over $1 million. That will raise almost $2 billion a year from the 19,500 taxpayers who have incomes over $1 million. I had no idea so many people in Massachusetts had incomes over $1 million. And it will be focused on, again, investing in education and transportation. And we're trying to put together a coalition that will have small business and some of the larger businesses and public educators and people who benefited from debt-free higher education in the Commonwealth back in there, 40 years ago, to get them to come forward and testify about the value of that kind of investment. We also have a ballot question to raise our state minimum wage and to institute paid sick leave. So we've been busy collecting signatures and running campaigns, so we're going to have a lot of initiatives in that way. And I don't know if any of you live in Maryland, but I think there are a lot of states that are trying to look at what just happened with the federal tax bill and saying, okay, particularly states that had progressive tax systems are trying to figure out what to do at their state level. At the federal level, the inheritance tax, the estate tax, the wealth exemption doubled for an individual. It was 5.5 million. Now it's 11 million for a couple. 11 million doubled to 22 million. So right there, the wealthiest households in the country just got this massive doubling of the estate tax. Well, by the way, we're glad that it didn't get abolished. We're glad it didn't get repealed. But a number of states have laws that mirror the federal law, like Maryland. And Maryland is now saying, oh, well, now we're going to delink our state estate tax, and we're going to keep it where it was prior to the federal law changes. And we're going to collect more money, and it's going to be spent here in Maryland. And they're also looking at a high-end millionaire tax, too. So I just mentioned this is just some of the examples, and maybe I'll stop there, and Terry and Maureen, whoever's going to moderate, maybe just if maybe I would start off by if people have examples from their communities or states where they see people doing, initiatives that, are kind of addressing these inequality issues. I didn't mention all the minimum wage efforts, but I think there are a number of things that are focused on raising the floor, linking progressive taxation to early childhood education is another thing. That's sort of the New York City Bill de Blasio proposal. And I realize I'm talking a lot about things that are happening in coastal states, and some of you may be in states where I'm just not aware of some of the things happening. So anyway, let me stop there, and either any clarifying questions about any of that, or sharing examples or things that you're working on or see emerging in your communities.
Well, first of all, nearly everybody is muted. And the way you get rid of the mute is to put the cursor in the upper right-hand corner of your little video box, and it'll give you a choice to unmute. I would comment on a couple things. One, we've been talking to our accountant weekly, and she has no idea what these laws mean and what we need to be doing to put ourselves in a good position. Our retirement is rental property, residential rental property. So we assume we're in a good position because that's what a lot of what Trump did or does for his income. But it's crazy giving us a 20% discount on rental income before we even start talking about paying taxes. There's no rationale why one industry should be given a discount. But they may figure out a clever way to avoid that. I'm glad you brought up about the California. I was going to ask you if you didn't say something about that. Anybody else have any questions?
I've been thinking about one thing, and that is here in the District of Columbia, the district is working really hard to try to provide affordable housing. And so every time they put up a development project, they make sure that there's significant percentages of affordable units that are available there. But it seems, and so I've also got some of my income from rental, and as I look around at the situation in DC, I say, look, it really isn't that hard to own property and rent it at at rates that are not completely horrible. The key to it is you do your best to keep down expenses, and you don't try to provide like a luxury apartment, so that you're not spending insane amounts of money to just keep redecorating it and repainting it all the time. And so it just seemed to me that part of the problem that we're experiencing right now is that since so many people are focused on marketing their real estate to rich people, that's part of the problem. And that if we could figure out a way to cause some investors to start saying, you know what, we need to start acquiring rental real estate for the purposes of providing affordable housing. And so it seems to me one of the first ways you'd go about doing that is you start off by making it a nonprofit. And then you're able to as a nonprofit, you're able to get some donations that would help make it so that people are actually investing and getting an income from it, but they're not demanding too much payback because they want to help with the affordable housing situation. They get more than they would have gotten because you have some endowment there. So they haven't actually paid for all of the real estate that they're getting income from. So anyway, so it seems to me there's some ideas there, and I was just wondering if people can shoot them completely full of holes in just 2 seconds or what.
Can I jump in for a second?
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? No one can hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. I want to jump in for 1 second. I was thinking, it's too bad the government can't build small houses, those portable houses that people are building. I don't know what they call them, mini houses or something like that, and have like a big field for those, and that would house all the homeless people that need housing.
Yeah, tiny homes.
Yeah, tiny homes.
Well, and along lines that I'm talking about, it's not necessary for the government to do that. It's possible for that to be done privately. And because now we're talking about the tiny homes, we're talking much lower real estate costs, and there are some private developers who are doing exactly that, but not very many, and so it doesn't add up. And furthermore, I think, when I take a look at the market for people who don't have insane amounts of money to spend on housing, but they do have some money. I think they would prefer to have a slightly nicer place. And so I'm able to like rent on Capitol Hill for prices that that can be afforded by congressional staff people, for example.
I actually see tiny houses as being a good solution for homeless people because often there are mental health issues that go along with it, which means they kind of need their own space as opposed to an apartment house where they would have to listen to people doing construction next door, like Chuck.
I would just one thing I've been noticing is I think there's a whole spectrum of solutions to the housing challenges. I mean, good private owners make an important contribution in the niche. You know, people who are sort of long-term owners and good managers. And I think as Peter was saying, sort of the nonprofit housing sector. And one of the things I think in Boston that we have going for us is there's 20% of the housing stock is in what we call social housing. And what I mean by that is it's either public housing owned by the Boston Housing Authority, but and we have a pretty good housing authority, and it really works to create decent scattered. There's like a real art in creating new quality scattered site public housing, well managed, family housing and the like. But we also have this sort of nonprofit housing sector and home ownership through community land trusts. I had this holding up my computer there, the Community Land Trust Reader. But, these are a couple hundred organizations around the country that, take land out of the speculative market, sell housing with a long-term security. If the property comes up for resale, they buy it back without the appreciation in the land value. So it's a way to kind of add housing. So my perspective is we should any city dollar that goes toward subsidizing affordable housing, as much of that should go toward this permanently affordable housing sector. So you're sort of adding to the stock of permanently affordable housing. And, the measure isn't the total number of units of housing. I mean, if you add a lot of housing units, it will bring the market cost down eventually. But if you really want to address the challenges for, say, the bottom half or the bottom 60% of households, the more of the housing that's taken out of the speculative market, the less people are competing in the speculative housing market, the better. So that's where I think like a high-end real estate transfer tax, again, on very high transactions, and dedicated to a fund for permanently affordable housing. So communities can say, okay, right now we have 12% of our housing stock is socially owned or permanently affordable. Our goal is to get to 15 and to 20. And how do we do that? We tie it up that way. So I think and I think the tiny houses are part of that. I mean, we have this whole focus in Boston on what we call millennial villages. Younger people who want to live in they're okay living in a smaller unit that has more community amenities, so there are these new apartment buildings that have, they're kind of like extension, they're sort of between college dorms and cooperative apartments, but it meets a housing niche. It frees up housing in the other part of the rental market for families and low-income workers. So that's another sort of, so people are willing to live in smaller units. If they have those amenities at a certain stage of their lives.
Chuck, this is Tom Ulrich. I'm from Pennsylvania. One of the underlying things that is frequently not mentioned and should, I think, at least be mentioned briefly here is all the things that are suggested require that our government or our legislative people pay attention to these things and vote for the common good. So I'm involved with a statewide organization working on good government kind of things. In Pennsylvania, we have a huge redistricting problem and automatic voter registration we don't have. We don't have open primaries and all those kind of things. And a lot of those are in other states also. So we at least can't forget that if we got to work to fix our dysfunctional government wherever it is.
Yeah, I purposely didn't really talk much about what I would call democracy reforms, but I think you all in Pennsylvania, you know, in the work around gerrymandering and districts and the state Supreme Court case, I mean, we're going to see the Wisconsin case being decided this year. We're seeing a couple of other states pushing back against political gerrymandering. And I think the work you've been doing in Pennsylvania is absolutely on target. And even here in Massachusetts, you know, we're pushing to try to improve voter access. It's you know, it's fairly decent, but there's no reason why we have some of the barriers that are currently in place. So democracy reforms is clearly a part of how we're going to move forward, and depending on what's going on in your state. So way to go in terms of keeping that, you know, building the pressure in Pennsylvania for those changes.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. We're here in Wisconsin and we've lost our progressive state totally. But I wonder if, Chuck, if you could spend a little bit of time on this high-end real estate transfer tax. I'm very interested. We live here in northeastern Wisconsin in a tourism area where there's a lot of high-end condos being built and a lot of real problems of housing for workers and indigenous folks. And this has appealed to me, and I wonder if you could just expand on it, maybe tell me where I could go to learn more about it and so on.
You know, I mean, a lot of states have just a simple real estate transfer tax on all real estate transactions. Like a number of, Vermont has a real estate transfer tax on every transaction that goes to something called the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And what's beautiful about that is it was a coalition of groups that were interested in open space preservation and affordable housing that came together to create this fund. And in a tourism area like northeastern Wisconsin, that might be the formula where you kind of both win over the Land Conservancy and the affordable housing folks together, and local jurisdictions have to decide how they're going to split that money, but they have to use half of it for one purpose, affordable housing, and half for conservation purposes. So that's like a sort of any real estate transfer. And then the question is on properties above a certain threshold. So in San Francisco, it's like a very high, 5 million and then up. But you could have a progressive element to that, which is maybe there's a little bit another rate that's on transactions above a certain level. And that goes into that same maybe housing and conservation fund. So I would look at a couple of the states that have done that and some of the campaigns that, and I think in rural areas, farmland preservation could be part of that, preserving traditional, the amenities that make that a beautiful tourist area. Everybody understands that that's at risk. And there are active conservancies, in that area. So that might be one way forward. In an urban area, I think you can just say flat out, look, this is all going to go for housing.
I like it because it has non-local people paying it, and they're not actually going to have a chance to vote it up or down.
Because they're absentee owners.
They're absentee owners. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the ways to get at the way in which a second home market can disrupt a housing market in a community. The other is you have a high homestead exemption. So if the property is owner occupied, you exempt up a higher threshold. And if it's an absentee home property, then you're paying the full value. So that's another thing I've seen is just a high homestead exemption.
Chuck, I'd like to ask a question. Other than chipping away at Frank Dodd and can you think of any ways that federal actors might seek to impose a cost on the communities that you've described? Is there some things here in Washington, D.C. that folks at UUSJ like myself should be paying attention for in order to help preserve the environment for these experiments across the nation?
That's a great question, Pablo. You know, I mean, that's where the fact that they sort of eliminated the state and local deduction was a real, it wounded these efforts. In fact, in Massachusetts, we knew that this was a possibility that might happen, but the fact that we are putting this millionaire tax on the ballot, it was very, very helpful to say, look, Massachusetts millionaires, you're going to pay higher taxes, but it's going to net be the same. You're going to deduct that from your federal taxes, and the money's going to stay here in the Commonwealth. It's not going to go to Trump. And that was a compelling argument for a lot of people, and now we sort of lost that. So maybe pushing. I think there is, there's going to be just pushback on that state and local deduction. I'm pretty surprised that it actually passed the way it did. So I think it's a vulnerable one. It's one of the ones that will be reversed, if there's some kind of pendulum swing. I mean, you got, all the Republicans in New York State and New Jersey and California are just going to they're going to lose their seats over it, so it's probably will be reversed. But I would welcome other people's ideas too. I mean, I think that you're right. We have to make sure that some of this can be protected, and I think things that are focusing like we are on real estate may be vulnerable to policies at the national level, where maybe they're going to preemptively try to keep some of these things from happening. So I think that's something we should be watching out for sure.
Chuck, can you tell us a little bit about your new book coming out? I'm curious what it's about and a little bit of a preview.
I have a book coming out in, I guess it's coming out in April in the United States. It's called Is Inequality in America Irreversible? ? It's a British press. That's why they say, is it America, right? But it's very similar. I was with some of you in October where I did a piece for the Next System project called Reversing Inequality, unleashing the potential of an equitable economy. And it's similar. It's sort of looking at some of what we're talking about here, which is what are the things we can do? What are the different interventions, and what are kind of game-changing campaigns? One of the things I talk about there is, taxing high-end consumption and, private jets and things like that, and directing funds to just transition, green economy interventions, or things that tax Commonwealth and help build a universal basic income. So it's a similar idea. Are there linkages there that can maybe excite constituencies, mobilize and engage people, get people excited enough to fight for something and defend it, and that actually will expand opportunity and reduce inequality? So I'm looking at the whole menu there. So think of it as it's a menu. It's not like Born on Third Base, which is more, getting at the stories that hold inequality in place. And, Born on Third Base is still rolling. People are, it's kind of, it has a second life really. So I'm still doing a lot of UU congregations and events, and Maureen has me coming to Colorado in the fall. And so in some ways it's more fun because it's more story based, but hopefully it'll be useful to just this conversation of how do we reverse inequality? What's it going to take?
Do you think it's enough to mobilize the 80% with these ideas, or don't we have to make the 10%, the 0.01% of the people realize it's in their best interest to have a more equitable economy. So we have to figure out a way to spin it and sell it so that those benefits, then they'll vote for themselves.
Yeah, that's been the kind of fun part of Born on Third Base. And actually, there's Rachel sent around a link to this interview I did with The Sun. The Sun is like a very cool literary magazine, and they have an interview. And this month I'm the interview, and I talk exactly, Mike, about what you're saying, which is, of course, there's a segment of wealthy people who are kind of, I would call them unreachable rich. They're happy with what they've got, and they are content with the story that justifies their wealth, etc. But my actual personal experience is there's a lot of very people in the top 5%, 1% who are waiting to be called to something more meaningful than consumption. They want to figure out how to bring their wealth home. So I was just in Maine with 40 of the biggest donors in Maine. They invited me to come and talk about what is it they can do to sort of step up and take bolder action, both to support public policy and support capital, moving to, bringing the wealth home and fighting, and this Patriotic Millionaires Network that I'm part of. These folks want to push a wealth tax at the federal level. It's not going to happen, in the next 2 years, but they want to seed this idea of a wealth tax with the argument that actually these extreme inequalities are bad for everybody. They obviously are really bad for low-wage workers, but they're also bad for people who have wealth, that it will create volatility and undercut, healthy economic life. And so I keep meeting people. Like there's this guy, Peter Georgescu. Actually, I just have his book right here. With this book, Capitalists Arise, right? He's the former CEO of Young and Rubicon, which is one of the biggest Madison Avenue ad agencies. His best friend is Ken Langone, who's the angel investor who started, Home Depot. They think these inequalities are killing the goose that laid the golden egg. You always hear people say, well, if you tax the wealthy, you're going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. What I love about their argument is they're like, no, actually, these extreme inequalities are going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, that they will undercut prosperity. So they're a really important part of this larger conversation. So a lot of the fun for me of doing the Born on Third Base stuff is I've been invited to engage with, high net worth audiences. And I try basically make the point that Mike made, it's in your self-interest here to come home, to bring your wealth home and bring it back to the Commonwealth and rejoin humanity and get in here and fix these problems before they get even worse than they are, So I think that is an important argument, and I kind of think that the class rage, class hatred stuff, I understand where it comes from, but I think it has its limits really in this moment when we can actually rally people together.
Thanks. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I've been noticing is that I have been seeing a few things here and there happening where people who do have means are saying, okay, we're going to start doing something a little bit differently. We're going to start up a private enterprise that is actually doing more in the way of addressing more of a public problem than a lot of the public enterprises have done in the past. If you're just out there trying to figure out how to make your fortune, now that's not the place that you're really going to be focusing on. If you want to create something like that, having the attitude of a nonprofit person is extremely helpful. But that's not a great way to make a fortune. You make the fortune by doing something that will sell with large profits, okay? but I think we are starting to see some of these things. And so Chuck, would you be interested in me sending you a little bit more in the way of my idea about this nonprofit for the, because it seems to me that if you're talking to audiences of millionaires, that talking to some of them about this idea, one of them might want to start such a nonprofit that I'm talking about. And there's a way to make that snowball so that you're not maximizing the profit for everybody. What you're doing is you're running a nonprofit as close as you can to being, I mean, the advantage of for-profit is that if it makes money, it snowballs, and it then becomes a massive thing in society. And if you take an attitude of nonprofit, that we're trying to do that a little bit, except that we're trying to get the snowball, but without handing out all of the wealth to the people that funded it.
You know, there's starting to be a kind of creative blurring between for-profit and nonprofit. You see more entrepreneurs starting the business with the intention of broadening, having broader ownership. They create, the businesses are owned, or they're transitioning to worker ownership. There's a whole generation of silver-haired, baby boomer businesses that are now being transitioned to worker ownership, not just overnight, but actually in a very kind of orderly transition where workers are being trained to govern and manage and oversee management of a company and expanding ownership. I mean, everything from, the Chobani yogurt example, but I can think of a number of examples along the spectrum. So yeah, Peter, I'm interested, and I'm also aware, for instance, on the investment side, there's a lot of people who are looking at impact investing. I think that's a great example of bringing wealth home, taking the money off the Wall Street grid, putting it back into, enterprises that are trying to meet real economic needs and that have the triple bottom line, social, environmental, and profitable. And, and some of that means, okay, some of these startups need debt, some of them need equity, and some of them need outright grant funds. And some of that comes from the philanthropic side, some of it comes from the investor side. There's just more creative blurring of that space. And I think that is what it's going to take. So yeah, I kind of lift up the taxation and redistributive piece of this because I don't think we're going to get there without that. But there's also a lot of space in the private sector and in this kind of socially oriented private sector activity that I think will also help. Like, where are we trying to go? We're trying to be more like the Nordic model. We want to have broader ownership of wealth. We want to have less disparities between top and bottom. So that's going to mean taxing high incomes and wealth and investing in public goods. But it's also going to be encouraging private enterprise and private sector activity to operate within more socially oriented norms and more worker ownership and employee ownership. So I think that's, I actually think that's not that unreasonable. There already are, the worker ownership sector is expanding. And if we provide sort of incentives and examples and inspirational models of that, there are lots of business owners who are at the point where, shall I sell out to this private equity fund? Or maybe I can structure this and sell it to my employees. They have already been running the company, maybe I'll do that. And how do you make that easier? How do you take out the original owners and what's that transition look like? So there's a lot of people trying to figure that out, which I think is really exciting.
Along those lines, we had a person the other day that was talking about how for her small business, when it came time to pay taxes, if she invested more in her 401k, she would have to pay less taxes. But that meant she was investing in businesses that were non-local and competing against her.
Mm.
And that was a real eye-opener to me. I'd never actually thought of that. but there ought to be a way that you can invest in your own business or your neighborhood business
Yeah.
to strengthen your community and get that same benefit.
Yeah. You hear people saying things like, I heard David Brancaccio on Marketplace the other night talking about, well, what about the real economy? Does all this stuff affect the real economy? And people are making, we used for Just Economic Community early on, we had David Corton come and talk to us a number of times. He sort of introduced this concept of there's the phantom wealth and the real economy, the living economy versus the predatory, the vampire squid that's sitting on top of the healthy economy that's sucking away extracting away all the life. He'd make that distinction. So you start to see people talking about, the real economy. Oh, you mean like goods and services and things that people actually need as opposed to the extractive predatory economy. I think there's some, concepts that are good to introduce into our regular conversation. Oh no, I'd like to invest in the real economy, not the frothy, extractive economy. And I think that's, I see that happening more and more, that people understand the difference.
It's 9:00. Thank you, Chuck, for spending the hour with us. Are there any last minute questions or anything that we should hear to close up?
Nope. If people want to reach me, you can find me at inequality.org. And appreciate the chance to be with people and love to hear more of what you're thinking. So keep me posted.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was interesting.
Yeah.